Tangshi looked at the reflection before her and stopped to wipe the single tear which made its way down her face. Tonight had been a blur of so much going on that she had not even a moment to catch her breath, to process what was happening, and now her heart was finally allowing itself to catch up. Sad for her situation and bitter that there was no way out, her dreams of returning to California were now dead for another 2 years. She stood alone in the spacious suite of Yuji Lang, her legal husband, and yet she had never felt so alone in her life, or so unworthy. She had been swept away, dressed, tugged, pulled, and pushed by a stylist in an expensive boutique before being thrust into a car to her doom, prettied up like a fancy cake about to be served at a feast. She had been led to a room where her father and lawyers sat, signed the papers that sold her soul to the devil, and made to digest all the details once more about what was expected of her. The license office was small, private, and they were rushed through, signed off, and told they were legally wed before she had a chance to read what she was signing. Her red book slid back towards her with the newly taken couple pictures. And there it was, married. This family moved fast, and the secrecy was incomparable to anything her father could have pulled off. It was unceremonious, unromantic, and made her feel like a piece of meat at market, sold to the hungriest bidder for a measly price, and then wrapped up and shipped home for devouring. Yuji had barely looked at her at all the entire time. His utter disinterest in her was soul-destroying. He didn't touch her, and even had the nerve to stand and use his cell phone while they waited on their documents to call his girlfriend. Tangshi had to endure listening to him sweet-talking another woman and telling her he would see her in a day or two when he took care of his duties. It was obvious to Tangshi he meant her, and the fact he knew their wedding night was inevitable. She felt humiliated to be surrounded by these people, while witnessing her new husband croon down his phone at his mistress. It hurt her pride and caused a pain in her chest that was almost like being stabbed with a searing hot poker. None of the people around them had seemed shocked at his behavior, or hearing him talk to that woman, or whisper their farewell. "I love yous." Tangshi's heart had turned to dust. It seemed part of the arrangement of their marriage between his grandfather and him was that Ria could stay secretly hidden but continue to be his companion, and that Ria understood they were now officially over. At least until after they parted in divorce, but what he did with his time as long as he was discreet was no problem. Old man even had the nerve to look Tangshi right in the eye when he uttered those words, making it clear she better not raise complaint and accept the decision. Tangshi had wanted to cry, blurt out about the unfairness of this, but nodded obediently and stared out of the window for the journey home, lost in her own mind and more miserable as the miles passed by. Her new forced husband would still spend his time with his playmate, and she would be left to do God knows what in a house all alone. "Miss, do you need assistance in undressing and bathing?" The sweet young voice of the girl who had been assigned to her care brought her back from her lost thoughts, and she blinked at her reflection behind her. A small pretty girl in her late teens, a little short and curvy, but utterly adorable. She had given Tangshi a warm feeling at first meeting, and she hoped they would have a harmonious relationship while under this roof. "No, Xiaosu? It is fine. I can do it myself." Tangshi dismissed her with a smile and a genuine warmth in her tone, hoping the girl would not feel offended at being refused, and turned her attention back to the image before her. She didn't want to appear ungrateful or cold, but she needed alone time. She looked nothing like she did a few hours ago. Teased into a slim and fitted red satin dress which hugged her curves and accentuated her slender frame. Her makeup was heavier than she wore normally, her hair pulled into an updo that made her look older somehow. Refined, almost identifiable as a young Miss of Lai, expensive and nothing like the girl she was. She wasn't disappointed by who she saw, it just wasn't her. Groomed into glamorous and almost noble, reeking of wealth. It seemed fake and shallow of her to get any enjoyment out of looking like she had stepped out from a palace, and she began to undo it all very carefully. It felt like a mask, one to cover the stench of her own shame, shielding her complete loss of any pride. This dress cost more than everything she owned, and she wasn't comfortable with that fact. Despite growing up in a wealthy family, she had never experienced it as if she was. She was inferior, and things like this made her nervous. She didn't want to damage or dirty it, and hoped it would be returned to Old Man Leng now her wedding duty was done. Tangxi was his wife now, and tonight he would have to make it official and commit to only sleeping with her until they divorced. How could he still act like she was a bothersome fly buzzing around his head that he had to endure? Yuji had absolutely no scruples and no sense of decency. Tangxi stamped her foot, grabbed the robe and draped it around herself before making herself busy and drying her hair thoroughly. Doing so in temper and not being delicate with her movements. Riled by that same fury she encountered at her father's house and allowing it to warm her cold bones. Yuji came sauntering out when she was finished, draped in a white towel around his waist. Boldly uncaring of not being covered in front of her, and nudged her sideways out of his way as he leaned in for the dryer in her hand. He didn't utter for her to give it over, but snatched it, avoiding her face in the reflection before them, and switched it on to drown her out. He blanked her presence and acted like she was not even there. It made her even angrier, and her simmering fury upped a notch. "You are a jerk!" Tangxi forgot herself, speaking out at his rudeness with a harsh snap, and then slamming her lips shut and turning away to simmer with anger. Knowing she really shouldn't be causing fights on the night of her wedding. She had met her share of arrogant and rude people in her life, but this one was completely the worst. She ignored his expanse of tanned and toned manly perfection. She would refuse him if he continued to make her feel this way. It is not like she had to be submissive at all times. She still had to consent before he could touch her in that way. She laid there seething, cursing him under her breath, and jumped when all the lights went out and left her in pitch black just after he switched off the dryer. Tangxi froze and stayed completely still, holding her breath as nerves increased, listening to the noises of Yuji moving closer. It still felt wrong. He didn't care if was married to her. She wasn't his girlfriend and wasn't someone he wanted to have sex with. Suddenly, ashamed that he thought the night dress was her doing. Tangxi didn't want to pass blame to Xiaosu, knowing she was probably only doing as she was told. So she shook her head instead, oblivious to Yuji's conflicted thoughts and growing distance, dumbfounded at how much venom he had in him for someone he did not know well and had made such awful judgment of. He had never mentioned their previous encounter either, so she wondered if this was all based on something she did back then, and didn't realize it at the time. She couldn't recall anything other than letting him kiss her passionately so many times that night. Maybe that was it. Maybe her allowing his kisses and hand-holding back then was the reason he discarded her so coldly. He thought women who allowed such intimacy were shameless. Easy. Surely he was more forward-thinking than that, or maybe his grandfather's traditionalism was ingrained, and he really looked down on her for it. But then he was the one who had kissed her repeatedly and pursued it when she was too shy. He had held her hand, hugged her close. More recently, he had a girlfriend who he obviously sleeps with if his manner is anything to go by. "You misunderstand my character. Yuji gave her no chance to defend herself at all. He really did think so little of her and so much of himself. This arrogant and spoiled stupid man, looking down on her for something she wasn't even guilty of and had no control over. How dare he think she had whispered begging words in her father's ear to secure marriage to this man? This egomaniac and asshole. She wouldn't have asked to even share air with him if she was given a choice. She only wanted a peaceful life and her independence far away from anyone in Shanghai. Tangxi opened her mouth and glared at his straight and foreboding figure in the darkness, outlined by the moonlight seeping in the cracks of the curtains in the window. Irritated by how blessed in attractiveness he was, but lacked any kind of charm, she had so many harsh words she wanted to say, to defend herself, to scold this idiot. But instead, she snapped her lips closed. She wouldn't lower herself to someone like him. Tangxi stretched out and yawned, balling a fist in her sleepy eyes, forgetting her predicament for a second, and sighed with just how exhausted she was. It was a fitful night of unrest, given her not being used to sharing a bed with a warm body, and the lingering anger which had made her toss and turn most of the night away. Yuji seemed to sleep soundly, oblivious to her presence, and not fazed at all that she was in his bed and hating on him so venomously. It only served to anger her on a whole other level, and the result was fatigue and dark circles under her normally bright eyes. She felt muggy and heavy, and her mood was already low. He was clearly no stranger to sharing his bed with a warm-blooded female. There was a rapid tap on her door that gave her the distinct impression someone was in a hurry and turned to see if Yuji intended to reply. Only she found his side of the bed was completely empty, and the room around her was bright and quiet, showing her he was not here at all. She had no idea when he got up and left. "Miss Lee, can I come in?" The hurried tone and sheepish voice sounded a lot like Xiaosu, and Tangxi quickly slid out of bed to go open the door and let her enter, remembering too late that she was wearing a scrap of lace and covered her chest in embarrassment as Xiaosu's eyes widened at first sight. The girl blushed and looked away with a small smile before averting her eyes to the ground and remembering why she was so frantic. "You are late for breakfast, and old master has already left in such a terrible mood." Xiaosu's hastened words, her strained tone, and instant paling of her skin told Tangxi this was not a great start to her new life here, and she had already offended the grandfather. She had a vague memory of being told the household were expected to eat breakfast with grandfather at dawn, and anyone who was late would be in the bad books for days. This was a tradition of this house, and would cause great offense to the rigid old miser. He liked his routine, and Tangxi had already messed up. Tangxi glared back at the empty bed one more time, cursing Yuji under her breath because he obviously got up and left her asleep on purpose. He had every opportunity to wake her and make her come down for breakfast. The fact is, he wanted to see her screw up and face his grandfather's wrath. "Quickly help me get ready." Tangxi pulled Xiaosu inside, suddenly frantic and panicking, knowing she had no idea where any of her clothes had been put when she arrived here. She was relieved to notice Xiaosu was carrying a dress and bag of undergarments for her. She had brought along something for her to wear that would not offend the remaining members at the breakfast table, and it looked pleasantly like something Tangxi would have chosen herself. "I am sorry. I didn't come for you before now. Young Master Leng had me go to collect the milk and eggs from the nearby village that Aunt is so fond of far earlier today, and told me to not bother you until I returned." Xiaosu flushed crimson, knowing what she said made it clear Yuji had delayed the girl, and did this to make Tangxi annoy his family members as much as she annoyed him. That man! How childish for a future CEO of the Leng Empire to scheme against her. Tangxi gritted her teeth, hurried into the bathroom to quickly wash her face, and pulled on the clothes that Xiaosu held out for her. It was a simple lemon dress with a daisy print all over, in a soft floaty fabric. The underwear was white and simple, not at all sexy, with new white slippers to wear downstairs. This was more Tangxi's style, and judging by the lack of labels, it seemed these had not just been bought. There was a fresh scent of laundry detergent, and they seemed to have been ironed meticulously already. "I brought them from my room because I heard young master tell the madame he expected you to come down, dressed for a strip club. He seems to have had your clothes that you brought with you left downstairs to be disposed of." Xiaosu knew she was saying things she really shouldn't, given she had worked for the Leng home for many years, but the girl was sweet by nature and had taken an instant liking to Tangxi the first moment she met her. She felt Yuji was being unusually cruel for his normally laid-back nature and unfair to sabotage the young Miss First Days and his family. For no good reason, she could sense she was not the scheming and spoiled rich brat that Yuji told his aunt she was. He was mad at the world for his grandfather forcing his hand in marrying a girl from a suitable family. But Xiaosu did not feel this was Tangxi's fault. She seemed like she too was put in a position she didn't ask for. His hatred for her made no sense to Xiaosu. "Thank you, Xiaosu. This really means a lot to me. I can't thank you enough for your kindness today. The girl was a little shorter and curvier than Tangxi, but this style of dress was loose and long, and on her slender figure it looked pretty, casual and formal enough for breakfast, and Tangxi hurriedly brushed her hair before following Xiaosu, in haste, to the awaiting breakfast table. She had spent years of her life at hostile dinner tables, so she braced herself for a scolding and an unpleasant meal, knowing she could endure it without losing too much face. Damn! This Yuji! Tangxi was surprised when she hurriedly walked into the open, beautiful breakfast room to see only 2 people sat at a long, low table, at far ends. A table which would easily sit 12 people or more, with a little squeeze. She expected a grand family of angry faces, but then she remembered the Leng family had suffered many losses in recent years, and the numbers were low. Many relatives no longer lived in Shanghai. The table was mostly empty, with only a plate in front of the older woman who sat near the window which framed the ornate garden. It was still early in the day, and when Tangxi entered, she felt eyes all turned to her as she blushed apologetically, lowering her head to show her remorse and averting her eyes from the grand lady who was piercing her with a stiff glare. The older woman was dressed in a beautiful, midnight blue, satin house robe that was traditional in style yet adorned with beadwork and beautiful embroidery, giving her an air of elegance. I am so sorry. I seem to have overslept due to not being used to my surroundings. It won't happen again. I'll do better. She gushed towards the hostile-faced woman, who was appraising her with scrutiny. She then flicked her eyes to Yuji, who was smirking like a smug oaf while glancing over some documents in his hand. Lounging casually while he took in her annoyed, pinched expression and seemed amused with it. He was very casual in his lounging position, despite being dressed in a shirt and dark gray waistcoat over matching dress trousers, his suit jacket over the back of his chair, and striped tie sticking out of the pocket. Good morning, wife, lazy as well as rude. Your talents surpass each one the more they show face. He smirked and went back to picking up his coffee mug and swirling it slowly before taking a deliberate sip. Every mannerism was slow, precise, and graceful, as though he knew he was far superior to her in every way. His posture, despite being relaxed, still exuded an air of command, and it only made Tangxi despise him more. Tangxi's spine stiffened, and the anger in her heart towards him increased tenfold. She was absolutely sure now he did this to make her look stupid, and now the grandfather was gone. And this woman was glaring at her like an evil imposter. He was trying to give them all the worst impression of her and make her lose face in the home she would have to continue living in. Sit down and eat. I don't want apologies. I just require punctual attendance. The aunt snapped, her irritation heavy in her low voice. She didn't even introduce herself, but given her attitude and the mature aging of her face, Tangxi assumed she was either Yuji's grandmother or his aunt that Xiaosu mentioned. Maybe his mother, if his father had been the older gentleman she met yesterday. But she gave no maternal sense to Tangxi and didn't seem overly sweet to Yuji at this moment either. Tangxi quickly sat at a seat one away from Yuji to give herself space, not caring if it looked petty, and he cocked an eyebrow at her and raised a mocking smirk her way, seemingly even more amused with her not wanting to sit near him. Nice dress. What happened to your little black number? Shame not to see you parading around in that all day. He was purposely trying to cajole her in front of this woman, and her face flamed crimson. He was referring to the sexy nightdress which she had been given, and he knew fine well it was not appropriate for anything beyond the bedroom. She would never wear it again. What happened to my clothes? She mumbled under her breath in a hissing response, low enough to only be directed at herself, but Yuji had sensitive hearing and chuckled to himself. He was amused that she already knew her clothes had been discarded, and she had nothing else for the time being. Tangxi clenched her fists and sat back when Xiaosu returned with a tray of food for her. Here, Miss Li, Aunt has ordered your diet should be suited for being fertile and readying for childbirth. She slid down 2 bowls in front of Tangxi that she had never seen before. In all her years living in China, she had never eaten anything that looked like this. One was plain broth with noodles and sliced vegetables and smelled bland and salty, while the other contained some sort of fermented paste mixed with eggs that stunk to high heavens, and Tangxi gagged at the sudden assaulting scent. She had no idea what these dishes were at all. They looked like someone who had no idea how to cook, had thrown together what was left in the food store, in a hope they wouldn't go to waste. "I am not pregnant yet," she blanched in shock, looking at the unusual breakfast as her stomach churned, then lurched in disgust and looked at the woman present for some kind of help. She just tutted, rolled her eyes in disdain at this bothersome girl, and returned to staring out at the garden, ignoring her with a cold face, and making it clear she was only causing herself further dislike. "Well, it is always good to get ready for it. Eat up. Aunt Ruizy is being more than hospitable by taking care of your dietary requirements to benefit our future child. Be grateful. She has a million more traditional recipes and herbal medicines for you to savor." Yuji was enjoying this. He didn't know finding himself a live-infuting partner could be so satisfying, and was really excelling at his mischief this morning. Lately life had been dull and monotonous, and now he had a new challenge to play with. He had watched her sleep so soundly when he rose, looking deceivingly angelic, and left the room smiling to himself that he would make grandfather curse the woman he had chosen over his more filial and wonderful Rhea. His plan was simple enough: to make his family regret never letting him choose his own wife and mother of his future children, while punishing this scheming girl for daring to force him to this outcome. Tangxi couldn't respond or retaliate, knowing it was futile, and had to grit her teeth, clench her fists, and steady her rapid breathing to conceal how angry she felt in this moment. She hated his cheesy and malicious smile as much as she was starting to hate him, but decided to not let him see it. If there was one thing Tangxi had perfected all these years, it was not showing someone who was bullying you that they were affecting you. She had plenty of practice at it. She picked up a spoon and chopsticks and dug in with forced fervor, trying not to gag on the mix of tasteless noodles and overstewed vegetables, or the fishy and sour accompaniment that had literally no spice to numb out the awfulness. She was sure she had never heard or seen either of these in the whole time she had lived on this planet, and whoever the cook was had overdone everything until it had the texture of mush. No doubt, another gift from Yuji, in ordering the servants to help make her life worse. Tangxi swallowed it all down, so painfully, and controlled every outward reaction and facial expression like a pro, acting as if this was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten, while inwardly retching and struggling to swallow, and even avoided drinking water or allowing Xiaosu to pour her tea until she was done. She didn't want to look like she was washing it down. She wanted to seem like this was adequate and tasty, and Yuji wasn't getting to her at all. The old aunt occasionally looked her way, and her expression seemed to get more ridged with every bite Tangxi swallowed. Her obvious dislike of the girl growing as she watched her, because she hated high and mighty women who tried to save face when they should be bowing. Tangxi didn't know if it was insulting her by being late, or if Yuji had already said bad things about her to color the water before she came down. She guessed it was probably both. "Well, as enjoyable as your company is, I have to go to work. Can't laze around like a coattail-riding trophy wife all day, can I?" Yuji picked up his documents and pushed his mug away, winking Tangxi's way with mischief, scooping his phone from the table as it lit up and smiled at whoever's name was flashing on screen. He leaned in towards Tangxi with a devilish look, and for a moment she paused, holding her breath, so sure he was going to kiss her on the cheek in a show of shock affection. He didn't. Instead, he leaned in and whispered in a threatening tone, "Stay out of my way. Don't expect anything from me to ease your stay here. Obey the rules. Do what you are told and be ready to produce an heir. Other than that, my life is nothing to do with you, and it is going to stay that way. Hope you are happy with what you asked for." He nudged against her arm and shoulder as he slid past, causing her to spill what was left on her spoon all over her lap and cursing him under her breath. Xiaosu immediately rushed forward to help mop it up, knowing she only had this dress and nothing else to wear. Tangxi stiffened and held herself still so as not to react, cursing the man to death in her mind. Yuji sauntered to the door, before throwing a glance back, enjoying the moment and hoping she had gotten his loud and clear message in the last 24 hours. She was the thorn in his side, and he was not going to make anything easy for her while he had to endure their marriage. He wanted nothing to do with her, and already had instructed Xiaosu to supply her fertile days to his phone by noon, after she was examined by his doctor. He would do his duty, and the rest of the time he wouldn't touch her in any way. He intended to ignore her presence unless he felt like torturing her a little. "You will be taken for a new wardrobe today. I do hope you have something clean to wear. I had your luggage burned as it was not suitable for this household. You don't need to carry on the act of poor and modest, my dear. It doesn't fly with me. Your father is one of the wealthiest men in Shanghai, yet you play the victim to turn favor. Despicable!" It was Aunt who spoke the venomous words, tossed Tangxi's way in a bitter sneer. Clear that for whatever reason she had joined her nephew in the dislike of Tangxi, and life was looking less rosy by the minute. Of course, they wouldn't believe that a daughter of Lei would be penniless and downcast, struggling to make ends meet. They only saw that her clothing was fake and an act to appear pitiful. "I will find something." Tangxi could only hope Xiaosu would have another dress, as the only things upstairs when she dressed was her nightdress and the gown she got married in yesterday. It was hardly something you would wear to go shopping. It was an evening gown, and only to be worn with jewels and high shoes. "Good. My assistant will take you. She is also collecting my pride and joy to accompany you and Xiaosu. Such a good girl and wonderful fashion sense. She will help you with your style and stop you from embarrassing us further." For the first time some animation and light flooded the aunt's face and her eyes sparkled with adoration. "Your daughter?" Tangxi inquired, trying to sound as pleasant and polite as she could, showing an interest in hopes of warming the atmosphere, knowing she had to walk on eggshells with this woman already if she was going to survive. "No, I have no children of my own. My future niece, of course. My darling Ria, such a joy. Someone you will never replace and should never have had the opportunity to stand in front of." Tangxi was sitting in the black stretched-out Rolls-Royce, with its tinted-out windows, beside Xiaosu's small and cheerful frame, and staring ahead at the cold-tailored women facing her. She had tried to be polite, warm even, when sincerely greeting this assistant on entering, but had been met with an icy stone-faced response of dislike. Xiaosu had greeted her with an almost fearful expression, as if this was a woman she already did not like, making it clear this wouldn't be a pleasant ride. The atmosphere was tense, conversation non-existent as they awaited Ria outside her home, so it was clear the women in this car had been forced together. Lang Ji was Aunt Ruizi's personal assistant, a sour-faced mature woman in her 30s, who wore perfectly fitted and severe business attire at all hours of the day. She was used to running errands all day long for the surprisingly productive aunt, who ran a successful and famous fashion magazine that employed Ria as a columnist. She had low tolerance to frivolous women and a severe lack of warmth and humor. She certainly had no desire to accompany these girls on a shopping trip of such a mundane nature either, and she was making it clear. She had been taken from her regular duties today to act as babysitter, and it had put her in a foul mood. Her boss had been insistent, though, that she was to make sure Tangxi was given enough clothes and accessories to represent the Leng family without causing embarrassment once she stepped out in the public eye. She had no choice but to be here, to pay the bills, direct them to appropriate boutiques, and be the word of Leng in terms of what was purchased. She had been given a spending allowance to meet, and she was not going to disappoint by not doing her duty. After all, Aunt had a reputation of being the queen of high fashion, and her new family member was already a disappointment. She had to remedy that today. Tangxi inwardly sighed for the 10th time, annoyed at all this hassle for something so shallow. She had never followed trends or been overly interested in the designer world or famous brands. It meant nothing to her. She loved to paint, so most of her clothes would end up soiled in some way. She had very few items she called her best, although Aunt had destroyed them all. It seemed these people were so obsessed with style and overall appearance that it had become a major thing they found fault over when it came to her. She hadn't thought her attire had been as bad as they made out, but after eating her breakfast, the aunt had given Xiaosu a list of things she expected to be done in the next 3 days. It had spun Tongxi's head and made her ears pop. They were all about being showy, being picture-perfect ready, and acted like Tongxi would be out there on a runway. Just because she was now of the family Lang, it seemed her hair was not the right color, groomed, or fashionable enough. Her nails were in a poor state. Her teeth needed brightening, and her skin required spa treatment. Aunt ordered that her scents, her lotions, her every pampering product was to be revamped by professionals. And she was to have a beauty regime set in place to suit the family she now stood in front of. Waxing, tinting, eyebrow restructuring, and even lip fillers were mentioned. Even her footwear had a long list of requirements, and she was thrust a checklist of every kind of event imaginable she would need clothing for. She felt like they were trying to make her over into some sort of pretend celebrity. A living doll, and Xiaosu had to explain that Yuji was indeed practically that. Tangxi had to be up to a standard to be able to stand next to him before they announced she was the woman who would be stealing Ria Cheng's place in his heart. Yuji had celebrity status because of both his position in society and his naturally gorgeous looks, which attracted women like flies. After all, part of the Leng name was that they were trendsetters in style and class, and Ria Cheng was a retired fashion model turned stylist. She had high standards to meet. What Tangxi hadn't really paid attention to when searching the internet for information about her new husband was that he was certainly very famous in Shanghai outside of business endeavors. He had a huge youth following that outshone many pop idols for just being a handsome and young wealthy heir who was about to step up as CEO for the city's most revered empire. He even had a fan club, overseen by a PR team, and his own group of assistants which solely paid attention to keeping him in the public eye and making sure his popularity stayed current. Just because he was charming, rich, and beautiful, and apparently that is all he needed to be. He rubbed shoulders with famous people, went to glitzy events, and was photographed as though he was truly a movie star. Yu Zhilang was Shanghai's heartthrob, despite his shrewd business brain and qualifications, and girls across the country wished to be able to call themselves his Ria. After all, they were the golden couple and loved by all, and had been for 3 years of red carpet life. Tangxi was depressed at the thought of what she knew was to come. Her head aching with all this new information this morning. She hated the limelight, and now she was going to have to face it head-on for a man who despised her. Smile in public while being forced to transform like Cinderella. Xiaosu had tried to confide in her and ease her worries by relaying little snippets she had overheard between Yuji and his family in the last days to ease her worry. It had only given her more to be upset about. Knowing so many details and plans of her own life had been taken care of, and her input was nil. It seemed the talk of marrying Tangxi had been ongoing while she was in California, and her father had only informed her in the last moments that this was even happening. The Leng family had known for almost 2 months. All this time, they had conspired, planned, and made arrangements for her life, while she was oblivious and studying fine art, living in a happy bubble that hadn't yet been popped and dreaming of a simple life away from home. If she had known 2 months back that she was to be called back, she would never have gone in the first place. She just couldn't understand why her father agreed if he was already planning this for her, unless he wanted her out of the way in case the Leng family saw her as unfit for purpose. Kept her hidden until they had fully agreed, then thrust her upon them. She wouldn't put it past her scheming father. Good afternoon. Sorry to have kept you waiting. Tangxi's thoughts were interrupted before she pondered any further on the details of her lost life, startled by the seductively sweet voice of a woman sliding into the car beside Lang Jie. She raised her chin and instinctively smiled a welcome as she was faced with an angel who seemed to glow with warmth and welcoming. Tangxi knew at first sight that this was the woman they had been waiting for, and was yet startled by how she looked. Up close in real life, her pictures had not really shown how naturally pretty she was in the flesh, with her elegant posture and slender figure in expensive clothing. Tangxi was surprised and had expected to see a less glamorous girl than what the media portrayed. Yet, she was wrong. She was the same in person. A flawless woman of great beauty who had a softness about her that made you immediately like her. Ria Chung had jet black hair over a pale and slight set of delicate features. Eyes a little large for her elfin face, but it somehow made for an innocent yet beautiful-looking girl that oozed a sense of vulnerability. Her eyes were darker brown than Tangxi's, but with her neutral makeup in peaches and her stained rose lips, her eyes sparkled like black obsidian at the two women facing her. She truly was breathtaking and a little surreal, especially dressed in a cream floaty layered chiffon dress and nude stilettos. That screamed of wealth. She had poise and atmosphere of elegance, and when she locked eyes on Tangxi and gave her a soft and heartwarming smile, it seemed to melt away the superior quality. Tangxi was faced with someone who seemed extremely loving and honest. The maternal aura seeped out so fluidly, and try as she might, Tangxi couldn't feel any dislike at all. "Hello, Miss Chung. It is nice to meet you," Tangxi answered, matching her gentle tone and wide smile, and pushing away all her preconceived notions about this woman. First impressions were that unlike Yuji and his arrogant personality, Ria seemed to be an enchanting and genuine lady. She gave off an approachable aura and looked you directly in the eye when she spoke. It made you feel special and heard, like she really acknowledged your presence. A sharp contrast to all the hatred Tangxi had met these past days. "I am sorry that we had to meet under such strange circumstances, and I know this must feel so awkward and uncomfortable. Given you are now married to my fiancé." "Sorry, I know, my ex-fiancé. It is hard to remember that and get used to it." Ria blushed, lowering her eyes as a pained expression crossed her face, genuine apology on show as she unsuccessfully tried to hide her obvious heartache. It was clear to Tangxi that this girl loved Yuji very much, and she suddenly felt an overwhelming ache of guilt and discomfort on her behalf. "For the time being, we all know the plans are for you two to marry once he has his heir." Lang Ji cut in with a biting tone and raised a catty brow at Tangxi before she had a chance to even reply, as though she somehow was the instigator in Ria's unhappiness and solely to blame. Tangxi swallowed down her hurt expression, smoothed on an understanding smile instead, and tried to formulate a response that wouldn't anger the assistant further. It seemed she didn't need to do anything to feel their contempt since marrying Yuji. "Don't be so harsh, Ji. I am sure Tangxi knows all this, and it is not necessary to be so rude or cruel. We should welcome our sister. We have to learn to live in peace and get along, so that this time moves fast and with little drama." Ria covered Langji's hand with her own, giving her a slight squeeze as if to smooth her ruffled feathers and press the point that she wanted harmony, not war. She looked back to Tangxi, no hint of malice in her misted gaze, only a gentleness that pulled you to trust her. "It has been hard to adjust for everyone. Grandfather sort of pulled this out of thin air, after so many years of letting us think he would eventually give his blessing to us. Don't take it to heart. There are many loyal and unhappy people right now who believed it was only a matter of time until we wed. I've been family to them all along. I am sure you are equally having a hard time processing this change in your life and walking into this situation." Tangxi was stunned that this was the first person to not assume Tangxi orchestrated and schemed for this, and she almost blanched that maybe Ria really was someone she could like. Would it be weird if they became friends, even while she had to have relations with Yuji to make a child? Tangxi could not get her head around it at all. Tangxi returned a sweet nod and smile, trying to show she understood, but was also gobsmacked at just how much she actually wanted to get to know this pleasant girl. Ria did not seem to be as she expected, or any kind of nasty of jealous at all, and it wasn't hard to see why Yuji loved her so much. Her fears about meeting this love rival, a clingy, nasty schemer, who would make life worse, died an instant death, and she relaxed a little, genuinely liking this goddess. She even felt deeply remorseful about the fact her presence had ruined Ria's own happiness. She didn't want to be a person that caused anyone suffering, let alone a sweetheart. I admit, this wasn't how I expected to spend my next 2 years. I don't want to cause trouble or make anyone unnecessarily unhappy. I'll try my hardest to be the best I can be. Tangxi meant every word. If she was shown kindness, she would be the person she always tried to be in her life, fair and respectful. She only retorted when people pushed against her abrasively. She didn't want to fight or live her days angry. She wanted a peaceful life and a goal to look forward to. Okay, as you wish. Now let's get going as we have a full day planned and a lot to accomplish. Langji butted in, glancing at Ria with a curt smile, but then glared at Tangxi once more, and Tangxi's heart sank all over again. Despite Ria offering a glimmer of hope that things might start to improve in this family, the assistant made it clear that the majority were against her no matter what. She had many battles to face to make them endure her position. Tangxi knew this was going to take time for them all to accept that Tangxi was Yuji's wife for now, no matter what they felt about it or what they did. And 2 years suddenly felt like a lifetime to get through. So you really liked her? Linlin expressed her confusion on the phone while talking to her lifelong best friend. Now she had a moment's peace, a little astounded at this strange turn of events. It seems her good-hearted honorary sister from another mother had been befriended by her new husband's ex-girlfriend. Linlin thought this was beyond weird, ridiculous even, and didn't have as much compassion or understanding as Tangxi in this situation. She had always been more of a protector of this girl, and this baffled her that Tangxi was so willing to get on with Ria. In Linlin's mind, Ria was the enemy. Yes, I guess. She spent the day guiding me, helping me. We picked out enough clothes to last a year. She has such classy taste, and she was so patient and gentle and kept that horrid Ling Ji away from me. I truly think she is not as bad as I was expecting. Tangxi smiled, genuine affection gracing her pretty face because she was speaking from the heart. Relaxing as she soothed away the pains of her tired body by rolling her shoulders and stood casually looking at gorgeous scenery. Tangxi, you have lost your mind. She is your love rival, Linlin exclaimed, trying to inject some sense, a voice of reason, outraged that maybe Tangxi was being taken for a ride by a master of scheming, an actress that surpassed most. She couldn't really believe that Ria would be so gracious to the woman who just robbed her of her blissful future. With Yuji, I don't love him, nor do I like him, and I never intend to. Tangxi was firm, a biting tone so instant it made her blush. A sudden fire in her belly, coming up to ignite her wounded heart as she stared from the window of the bedroom in the Lang mansion. The only thing that could prick up her aggression and anger tonight was that man. One mention of him and boom, a stick of dynamite was lit. She stood her ground, aware of her outburst, taking calming breaths to return to her zen state of before, aware this was an overreaction. Overlooking the pretty flowers in bloom below to return her calm state of mind. All while Xiaosu put away all her new purchases behind her in companionable silence and kept her eyes on her task. The day was coming to an end, and Tangxi was not looking forward to dinner with the grandfather before being allowed to go to bed. She still had to face Yuji too, but she knew with her schedule now that he wouldn't do anything until her fertile day came in 3 more days. Linlin sighed helplessly at the other end of the line. Knowing that Tangxi was just trying to find a way to navigate this living situation, but Linlin was a romantic who had other ideas about why Yuji stood her up 5 years ago. Stubborn and impulsive, she wanted Tangxi to loosen up a little to the possibility of her new situation. Yuji was rich, famous, and gorgeous. Despite his attitude towards her little lotus, she knew Tangxi would win him around before long, and she was certain Yuji had reasons for that night. Even if Yuji turns out to be your masked fantasy from your 16th birthday, can I just say though, he gives me crazy strong Shandao vibes, as you know he is my ultimate bias actor. He could be his twin. You never told me he was that level of gorgeous. How I didn't know your masked man was Yuji Leng is beyond me. Linlin knew all about him, about how hurt Tangxi was afterwards, even if she hadn't been there to accompany her on that trip so long ago. She had been held back for family affairs while Tangxi had been sent out to give her father a break from looking at her face. Her birthday was spent with strangers on a convenient school trip in another city. So her family didn't have to make effort, and her best friend wasn't even allowed to be there. It still angered Linlin to this day that her girl suffered all by herself and then came home with a broken heart. Linlin would have hunted Yuji down had she known it was that infamous poser and dragged the truth from him. What difference does it make? He is not a nice person, even if he looks like your current celebrity crush, and that night, it was all about seducing me. I see that now. I didn't give him what he wanted, so he left me on that bridge. If it is him, then it is all the more reason to dislike him. Tangxi had given this a lot of thought this afternoon, when getting to know Ria and seeing how sweet a soul she was. It shocked her that someone like her would be with someone as aloof and cold as Yuji, and strengthened her heart against him. She had also come to realize that it was the fact she was only 17 that he left such a lasting impression. She had implied to him she was 18, assuming he was 2, and her naive little heart had been suckered. The reality was, he was turning 20, now she could count it backwards. Mature enough to know how to play with a girl's heart. You know what I think about that night? Linlin started again, but Tangxi cut her off with that tone she hated so much. Stern. Yet also stubborn, while somehow sounding calm and commanding. I do. You think he might have had some grand reason for not coming, and that fate concluded it was not our time to meet, Linlin. Tangxi sighed. You read too many romance books. He didn't even acknowledge me, so it looks like I left such a small impression that he didn't even recognize me. Maybe he is pretending. Maybe his heart swooned, and he kept it secret because it will betray Ria. Linlin knew she was being overdramatic and giggled as she said it, lightening the mood once more, but Tangxi could only sigh, a deep heaviness in her heart, even if she had repeatedly reminded herself Yuji was a liar and a womanizer. Then asked me if I was the maid. Yes, sure. Such a charming line. Tangxi reminded her of relaying the details of the last few days when she first got her chance to call her. She didn't care that Xiaosu could hear every word. Somehow in such a short time she had invested her full trust in the girl. She had no doubts about her at all. Xiaosu seemed to be loyal, true, and very protective of her new miss already. Today she had played dampener between Lang Jie and Tangxi any time she got close, and Ria was preoccupied. She was already so fond of little Xiaosu and didn't want secrets between them if she was to spend her every waking hour with her. Xiaosu was folding clothes and putting away her new dresses and shoes. Listening but really not trying to. Her heart raced at the mention that Miss Lie may have known Yuji so many years ago, and had some sort of romantic interlude before he dated Ria. Xiaosu was a believer in fate, and these past years she had watched the young master with a growing sadness. She believed if Yuji truly loved Ria as he made out to the world he did, nothing would have stopped him from marrying her and already producing heirs. There was nothing old grandfather could have done to stop them had an illegitimate child come out of their union. He would have insisted on a fast marriage. Yet Yuji never betrayed his grandfather, and despite having Ria by his side, he never truly seemed content or happy. There was affection, and maybe stability and mutual trust. But there was no passion. To Xiaosu they looked like best friends who enjoyed one another's company, but the intimacy and affection you expect between young ones in love always seemed lacking. The sad fact was Xiaosu could honestly say Yuji had not been a happy person for the many years that she had been employed by the family. Since first his father, then mother passed, followed by the tragedy of his extended family and an ill-fated plane crash. Xiaosu believed Ria picked up the pieces at the right time and was the only reason Yuji finally let a woman close enough to start dating and commit. Xiaosu didn't believe that Yuji had fallen for her truly, and instead he was dependent on her and used her as a shield and a crutch. So, Miss Lee, when are you coming out to play so I can properly hug my sister and introduce her to Shanghai high society? I have missed you too much. Linlin changed the topic as she could feel Tongxi was getting tired of turning it over, her mood souring, and it is the last thing she wanted. Linlin finally had her home again, so much sooner than planned, and she wasn't going to waste time. Even though Tangxi was now married to the Lang family, Linlin saw it only as a blessing. It brought her more freedoms than she ever had in the Lei home, and it meant that someone, even if grudged, would now take care of Tangxi's health and finances, where no one did before. Linlin could see that even in a hostile environment, she was still better off than being with her own family. Yuji may not be kind to her, but at least he had to show her some kind of care to make sure she carried a healthy child, and in public he would have to acknowledge her as his loving wife. Linlin could only hope that soon he would see how pure and good of heart her Tangxi was, and that he would soften to her better traits. She had pure faith that anyone who spent real time with her best friend would fall head over heels in love with her good heart and compassionate soul. Not for a few days yet. Not that I have ever been part of high society, nor do I wish to be. It seems I am to be primped and preened and turned into a beauty queen. I had an examination today too, and now my belly aches with the amount of remedies and supplements I was given to improve my womb's health. I feel like a walking prized baby oven. Tangxi had endured an hour in an office, being questioned and examined until her face flamed, and she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. Embarrassed about the topic, and mortified her male doctor had to place hands on her and do things she had never experienced before. She now had an app on her phone to track her periods and fertile days, and Xiaosu had obediently taken all written documents and left them in Yuji's assistant's care at noon. He whisked them away for Yuji to inspect and make plans. It all felt very sterile, the lack of romance in the whole thing. The cold reality of it had made Tangxi feel so many bitter emotions. Yet she swallowed them and reminded herself that this was her path to freedom and a better future, and she just had to endure. Boo. Oh well, I guess that gives me time to make plans for us to have some fun. I start my second term of fashion school soon, so we have limited time before I have to return to my dorm and be a good student. Father told me I was allowed no outside activity when term time was on because he is paying enough for such a pointless education. Linlin laughed at her father's grumpy words, someone who hated fashion and the entertainment business, yet he spoiled her too much and did whatever his daughter asked for. This was her third career change in 5 years, and he allowed her to do whatever she wished. The girl had first been an entertainment journalist and then started a business degree before switching to fashion. She was too impulsive. He knows you too well, party queen. It is not good for you to drink so much and go dancing to clubs so often. It is not a good reputation to have for a notably wealthy Shanghai heiress. Tangxi scolded her gently, that maternal tone moving in because she only wanted what was best for her friend, and she knew Linlin was a wild child. She loved to drink, party, and go out for fun and laughs. Very few knew that she had little to no interest in meeting men at these times, though. Only Tangxi knew that Linlin's heart was on her career when she chose which path that was in her future. But she liked to use fun as a stress reliever. Linlin had sworn that despite her inclination towards marriage, she never wanted to do it. Maybe because her father was on his third wife, and Linlin's own mother was on her second husband. They had tarnished her view of marriage forever. It was a wonder she had such a penchant for romance at all. Well, when it was not related to her own beating heart anyway. PFFF'd. You, what do you know? You are such a good and quiet little specimen, and that has been your problem for too long. You are protected now. Going out, being seen, attending parties. It is all beneficial to Mr. Lang, and I am going to make full use of your new status. After all, someone needs to accompany the heart of Master Lang and treat his wife to the social side of Shanghai. Lin was excited even thinking about all the opportunities they would have. Now Father Lei didn't control Tangxi's activities. I don't think Yuji will be too thrilled with those plans. From the schedule his assistant handed Xiaosu today, it seems my life is controlled by him now, and my appearances will be at his side. He has everything mapped out for our slow introduction to the world. Tangxi had almost laughed at the almost military planned operation of Tangxi's being put in the public eye while Ria was slowly receding. The PR team had timelines, planned dates, and even Ria and Tangxi double dating in 6 weeks' time to show she supported the new woman in Yuji's life. It was bizarre. But the story was that Yuji and Ria realized after a lifelong friendship that their romance had faded, and they were truly only friends. They had amicably decided to part, and in coming weeks, Tangxi was to be introduced by Ria and supported in the dating, engagement, and then marriage of her ex-boyfriend. It was ridiculous to read, but knowing the power of the Netzians and the popularity of this prized couple, it was apparently a necessity. The public opinion held power, and they didn't forgive easily, especially not a golden couple breaking up for a third woman to enter. No one wanted scandal. No one wanted Yuji to be called a cheat, or Ria to be portrayed as a broken-hearted victim. Lang's reputation was everything, and grandfather got what grandfather wanted. An heir from a family he respected, an obedient and married grandson, and the name of his empire still held intact. If only they all were to find out how grandfather pushed aside Yuji's love and arranged this marriage purely on title. How would they feel about the Great Lang Group if they found their idyllic love couple were ripped apart and Yuji was being forced to have a baby with someone he despised? A stranger who was picked out and thrust in his bed after a rushed marriage they would be lying about until it was appropriate to reveal it. So many shady secrets and pretense. That kind of gossip would cause all sorts of drama. This marriage was a joke, and with a foundation of lies. Tangxi knew it would only get worse. Yuji sat behind his huge, real walnut wood desk, alone in his spacious, modern top-floor office, which overlooked the curve of the Huangpu River, and was a spectacular sight when the sun set every evening. The Oriental Pearl Tower in his line of Weissen and acted as a sundial for times of the day as shadows moved around it against the skyscrapers beside it. He chose this particular side of their foreboding spike tower in the sky to savor this every day and remind him of how small humans were in comparison to the city around him with its ever-changing energy. He often worked late and felt it was the most comforting sight when red sky kissed Luzhizui in such a fiery way and made all the buildings around somehow glow with an ethereal kind of magical light. He loved his city, loved the contrast of old and new, and the history contained within the fiber of this bustling place. It made him feel his most content when stood up here, overseeing it all. It was at this hour, the setting of the day, and moving to night, that Yuji often found he did his best thinking. When his mind was clear of the day's hustle and bustle, and he could unwind to a slower pace to finish off what he needed to do, and other thoughts were allowed to invade his mind. Most of the Lang Group employees had left for the day, and only some of the higher-ups, like Yuji, still hung on to oversee the smallest details of the empire. He may not yet be the CEO, but his grandfather had been filtering the responsibilities his way for the past 3 years in readiness for the final takeover, and he felt he was more than ready and willing. He just needed to cross this last hurdle to meet his grandfather's end-of-life wishes, and then Yuji could have the life he had finally planned. 2 more years, then his vows would be lifted. "Hey, you busy?" Zhengli's voice pulled him out of his daydreaming as he stared at the contract in his hand and realized he hadn't taken in the last few paragraphs he had been reading for the last minutes. He sighed, throwing them down in disinterest, and looked at his personal assistant's smiling face, always warmed by his best friend's presence. One of the highlights of his life was having his lifelong friend always by his side and carrying the burdens of the day. "Yes, but I need a break. Want a drink?" He nodded to the bar in the corner, and Jengli moved without answering to pour them both. A well-deserved scotch, knowing fine well today had been a long and hard shift for them both. So much was happening this week in terms of the Leng group, and it didn't help that Yuji had to take a whole day off to attend to his personal commitments. They were in the middle of a takeover, and so many details were up in the air that time off was nearly impossible. Zhengli was only too aware of Yuji's recent life changes and his resistance to his forced marriage, and where he was yesterday. Zhengli felt sorry for his friend, but knew that some traditions were hard to refuse, especially when it came to old grandfather Leng. He was just glad his own family held no such power over his future choice of a bride, and when the inclination took him, it would be someone he loved. He was from wealth too, but as the youngest son of 5 he wasn't required to uphold his family business or birth line, and had chosen to work with Yuji instead of joining Yushin Corp with his brothers. "Thanks. What is up anyway?" Yuji took the decanter of thick glass from Zhengli, swishing the dark liquid inside, and placed it to his lips as he tugged his tie loose to give him a more relaxed look. He was uptight today, carrying tension in his upper body, and had been on edge since that damned wedding paper was signed. He didn't want to think about it, as every time he did, he got that awful knot in his stomach, and he couldn't shift it away. "I have the full PR schedule ready for the public announcements, and your wife's assistant brought over the medical notes you asked for. Are you really going to plan out your nights of intimacy to the letter? Kill the passion, and make it a sterile union?" Zhengli chuckled. A little amused by the cold approach Yuji was taking to this arrangement, and then stopped smiling when met with that dark scowl on his friend. Zhengli was his closest ally, but he even knew when Yuji's mood turned dark he should shut up. His bestie had a bad temper sometimes, a brewing sort of sinister, and with his 3 years of voluntary military service behind him in his younger years, capabilities of beating Zhengli up. Yuji wasn't laid back and fun-loving as Zhengli, and he had a line you shouldn't cross. "It is an unavoidable act in terms of pregnancy, but doesn't mean I have to do it. There are other methods. Ria is barely able to stomach the fact I have to do it at all, and I don't want to harm my future with her. I found a clinic that can inseminate." Yuji scowled. Mentioning Ria's name always brought out the worst kind of mood in the man when this was the topic. Zhengli had heard 2 months' worth of his fuming and venting over his grandfather's request to marry from the Lei family, and nothing had swayed his mind. Ria's tears only added to Yuji's mindset on this, and Zhengli knew it was a sensitive topic. Inseminate. "Are you serio?" His chuckle of disbelief and question was met with a blank look of seriousness, and he shook his head, backing down in disbelief. He never thought Yuji could still shock him after all these years, and yet it seemed he was wrong. For some reason, Old Man had it in his head that a grandchild must come from 2 of the wealthiest families in Shanghai. If the future of Leng was to be secured, and as Yuji was a doting grandson who worried over the old man's health, he didn't disobey. Zhengli knew it was nonsense, as this company was soaring to new heights as time passed by, and he had faith that Yuji would be an even more impressive master at the helm, in just 3 years with him as acting second in command. They had already broken so many records and achieved a profit rise of 63% from last financial year. Grandfather was set in his ways, and maybe a little broken from the loss of so many from the family these past years. And it had colored his requests when Yuji came of marrying age. "You are not exactly giving the girl a fighting chance." Zhengli sympathized for Tangxi, having seen her briefly when Xiaosu, the little cute house girl, jumped out of the car to hand over papers at noon. Zhengli smiled at the memory of that tiny, curvy, little bundle of joy, and often thought if she wasn't one of Yuji's house servants, he would have had some fun with her. He was a hot-blooded male after all. And Yuji snorted, cradling his drink, and went back to staring idly at his paperwork without really taking it in. He wasn't in the mood to work anymore, yet he had no will to go home either. He didn't want to go spend time in his space where she now invaded, and Ria wouldn't be coming over anymore as she did. Now they had to play a certain way for the public. She is pretty, seems quiet, and scheming, cold, calculative, and spoiled, Yuji finished, reciting all the things he had gained from meeting with the lad. Father, these past months, he had figured that a man like La with his list of unpleasant traits would surely have passed them down to a daughter, who sweet-talked her father into arranging a wedding. He had no stomach for women like this, and had seen way too many who had tried to seduce him over the years. To get a chance at being the next young miss of the Leng family, I can see that you already decided she wasn't worth giving a chance to. Zheng Li sighed and perched his butt on the edge of the desk, pulling his tie loose, then completely off before shrugging his jacket from his broad shoulders and tossing it on a nearby chair. As specimen of masculinity, these two shared many good traits and people often thought them cousins. As teens, both had equal female followers, although Yuji became famous with his position in Leng Group, while Zheng Li tried to stay out of the spotlight, so his life could remain free. Why should I? I already chose my wife, and she is just a stopgap to fulfill a role. I don't need to do anything except endure her and ignore her. Yuji grimaced, and then finished his drink in one gulp, savoring the burn as the alcohol made its way down his throat. Sometimes I miss the old Yuji. The guy who had a little warmth. Zheng Li joked, but his words were half true. The fact is that 8 years back, Yuji stopped being the boy who had been carefree and happy, the laid-back and loving younger son of Leng. His father died so tragically and revealed such a heartbreaking secret that had affected Yuji on so many levels. Then, his mother's death followed because she couldn't bear to live the lie anymore. Although the public only thought she had a severe sickness and not that she had taken her own life. Leng family had so many skeletons in their closet in the past half-decade, and Yuji was shouldering the responsibility of so much. It had worn him down, pushed the joy and care from his heart, and created this cool and often heartless man. Zheng Li often wished things had turned out so differently. And maybe if one little incident back then had played out better, he might have had that glimmer of happiness to help him through. One night, a girl he was instantly smitten with might have been the crossroads to a different outcome. Ria seems to like her, Zheng Li added, as though that fact would sway Yuji in some way, and only met a frown, an unhappy look of, "Who cares?" infuriating as that was. Do you have something other than my new burden to talk about, or was that the whole point of coming in here to bother me? Yuji glared at him, his irritation rising. Normally Zheng Li's hanging out with him was a mood lifter, but not today. Zheng Li burst out laughing heartily, at the pinched expression of his brow, and the sudden stiffness of his posture, despite his loosened and slightly rumpled clothes. I came to hang out with my bestie, and to drink. You are so sulky tonight, my boy. Why don't we get drunk, and you finally go home and feel a woman the right way? You have a willing new toy that doesn't need a clinic to intervene on your behalf. Zheng Li knew he was pushing the boundary with his bold remark, but he didn't care. Yuji could go on acting like Ria was his whole world, but Zheng Li knew he had never once told Ria he loved her, and he could never understand why. If he did, why couldn't he tell her he did? She had laid it all out there for him, heart and soul, and yet Yuji had never uttered those 3 little words. I am sure I can hold off until I get my girlfriend back. Yuji ignored the obvious attempt at goading him and got up to fetch himself a second drink. He could tell Zheng Li was in one of those moods, where he pushed his buttons for the fun of it and he had no desire to bite. He was tired. Come on, at least admit to me of all people, that you find her sexy attractive, that a part of you isn't glad that old man gave you such a beauty. I mean, I wouldn't say no to her. She has certainly got that whole natural thing going on. Zheng Li had always been more casual when it came to sex and women, much like Yuji used to be. He wasn't a womanizer. but he appreciated pretty girls and had dated with sex before. Jangli saw the marriage pictures and was pretty surprised that Yuji's new bride was extremely beautiful in her own way. Something soft yet familiar about her. Yuji stood stock still, his posture emanating a power of threat and warning without even trying as he poured himself a drink and ignored his friend completely. His sex life was his business, and he didn't want to discuss it. "You can't lie to me, brother. I know you think she is hot. I saw her, remember. She is totally your type. She kind of reminds me of that girl back in." Jangli hinted at where his thoughts had already strayed, but didn't finish because Yuji spun on him, his expression under a furrowed brow, an instant dark mask of sinister warning, and even Jangli knew to stop mid-sentence. We don't ever talk about her in relation to this woman. That girl, she stays in the past, and there is no similarity, miles apart. I told you a long time ago, I was done looking for her, and I won't talk about it again. I have Ria, that is the end of it." The snarl, the venom of his tone, and the killing intent made Jangli sigh. "And you say you forgot her, yet you act like this when I bring her up. It has been 8 years, so why do you get so mad? It was one night that didn't go beyond cuddling up and making out." Jangli was maybe bold enough to push him, but not stupid enough to be close enough to get beaten for it. He swiped his glass and moved to the other side of the room to lounge on the long leather sofa, pretending he needed to sit, while really, he was moving out of the firing zone. "Why are we even talking about her? This has nothing to do with now. She is gone. Everything that night was probably a lie, and she has never been seen again. Maybe I imagined it, and her. Maybe I was drunk and hallucinated. And she was really ugly and old. I looked and no girl named Alice was registered at any of the hotels there, so she even lied about her name." Yuji had this conversation so many times in the first year after the masked ball, and he didn't want to rehash old wounds. Truth be told, the thought of that girl gave him a stabbing pain of regret in his heart. Even all this time later, he didn't want to think about how she had made him feel that night, and how she had lingered in his thoughts all those years after when he failed to meet her on that bridge. "Then I must be sharing your hallucinations, because I saw her too, and masked. She was still cute. I also saw the two of you running off into the sunset together. I must also be infected by your madness." Jangli smirked, amused by this, and knowing that despite Yuji's roaring temper, there was a part of him that still pondered whatever happened to her. I mean, he did spend a year looking, and then another year after trying to let go. Jangli had never forgotten, and he found it interesting that his new wife held some similarities to the girl he remembered from the past, even if the stories didn't match up. And they didn't, because it was the first thing he checked when he saw the photo 2 months ago of this Tangxi Lei. He had felt hope, possibility, even though he liked Ria, and then lost it when he saw she was a beloved daughter of Lei Enterprises, not some poor unloved semi-orphan whose father tossed her away, as that girl had told Yuji. Tangxi didn't seem to have an alternate English name either, which would have explained the Alice. "Can you stop? I've things to do and I want to call Ria and wish her good night before I have to go home. Everything is messy now that old man insists I share my bed with her." He grumbled, finally stalking back to his seat and slumped down in such a disheartened way. His head was starting to ache, and his mood was only going to be sourer from this hour on. "She has a name, you know. Quite a nice one. It means sunshine or something." Jangli teased, knowing that was a lie to vex him, and got the cocked brow and glare sent right back. "Funny, as I heard it was a boy's name and probably doesn't mean anything of the sort. Maybe her father expected a son and was too lazy to give her an appealing name." Yuji dismissed his friend with a hand gesture and went back to staring at his desk before lifting his expensive shoe-clad foot and propping it on the shiny surface. He acted like he didn't care, but Jangli knew he was just being moody, acting out like a prepubescent child. According to her file, her birth name isn't Tangxi anyway, but that her father uses the name he bestowed on and not what was registered at birth, so I guess that is why. Did you not see when she signed the marriage license what name she used? I can get it for you if you don't believe me. After all, you made me take everything and file them for you in the safe. Zheng Li shrugged, finding his friend's combative attitude towards an innocent girl somewhat irritating, and decided to no longer play. He figured Yuji would cool down in the next weeks as he got used to this new role as husband, and maybe his hostility to the poor woman would improve. Zheng Li wasn't a bad guy, and he didn't like seeing people treated badly. Especially not by his best friend. Yuji really didn't care either way, but it did pique his interest to wonder what other name this girl might have. Maybe it was even uglier and was the reason she didn't use it. Imagine if her name was worse, and she hid it in shame for being graced with something unlovable. The thought amused him, as petty as it was, and on some sadistic level, he smirked his friend's way. "What is it?" he inquired, only half interested, hoping it was something he could tease her with if he ever felt like. Zheng Li paused for a moment, a new tinge of light in his eyes as he laid himself out casually, stretching himself taller and getting comfy. A sense of smug moving over him that the name he read actually was pretty ironic. "It is Ming Yun." Zheng Li smiled wider, a little happy that he knew this would annoy Yuji. The translation of the word not lost on him, and Yuji stared back in disbelief. He snorted at his friend's stupid joke, shrugged like he was a total liar, and turned away with a dismissive wave. "Asshole. You are not even close to funny." Yuji didn't believe for 1 second that his new burden, the UN joy of his life, the changer of all his plans, the thorn in his side, was actually called destiny. Tangxi sat through an awkward and very late strained dinner at the Leng family table. After brief introductions to a few new faces for the meal, and of course the sulking grandfather who ignored her presence, it seemed the family was already too focused on other things to notice her. Because of the surge of extra bodies, she had been seated at Yuji's right hand and was quietly eating the same bland, so-called nutritious food from Aunt's rigid diet plan, while everyone around her was indulging in some spicy noodles and beef. Even the array of side dishes was out of bounds for her, and she had been forewarned to eat only what was laid before her on Aunt's orders. They smelled divine, and with the several opulent dishes to make her mouth water, Tangxi had no appetite for the clear broth in front of her and her simple side salad with no dressings. Everything was tasteless and lacked spice or flavorings. She was sure the cook was deliberately overboiling anything edible to make it unpalatable too. "Why are you not eating?" a female voice demanded of her sharply, and she lifted her eyes to see Auntie was glaring her way, and the fact she was using her spoon to push the liquid around rather than eating it. It had been 15 minutes at the table, and Tangxi had swallowed only 3 mouthfuls in total. "I am sorry, Auntie. I am just not feeling hungry tonight. It has been a long day and I am tired. I'll eat it." Tangxi forced herself to swallow another down while counteracting her need to gag, her body stiffening as she pushed the soup into her belly, but tried to remain expressionless. She heard Yuji snort his amusement under his breath as he dished himself another serving of beef, and the smell made Tangxi yearn for a little taste of the delicacy. She wouldn't ask him though, as she had told herself not to let him see how much any of this was getting to her. She could ask Xiaosu to fetch her food in the night when most had gone to bed, and she could eat something with taste. Yuji was a sound sleeper, she had learned, and never stirred once when had passed out from the world, so wouldn't be aware. She would get up to eat. "Auntie is going to so much bother of personally overseeing your nutritional needs. The least you can do is appear to like it," he scolded her quietly, for her ears only, and Tangxi blushed at the sudden direct instruction from him. His voice low and husky that gave it a sort of seductive and dangerous edge when he whispered it so carefully this way. She had to hold herself still to not glare at him for his unwanted input, even if he had blatantly ignored her for the last day or so. She didn't welcome his sudden attention. "I didn't say I wasn't enjoying it," Tangshi gritted out in an equally hoarse tone for his ears only, not knowing what it was about this man that made her always want to talk back. But she really didn't like his arrogance at every sparse interaction they had. "You don't seem to be," Yuji added, not knowing why it was he insisted on talking to her when she was in his space. He had sworn on his drive home from the office that he would blank her presence and go to bed. Yet here he was whispering like a secretive couple at his family table. Try as he might, whenever he had to put up with her, he wanted to behave like a juvenile and get some sort of reaction from her. It wasn't who he was in life, yet she seemed to make him want to act this way. Normally his cool and aloof personality was what he was famous for, and yet with her, it was tit for tat and immature mini squabbles with every word from his mouth. She affected his moods, and even at work, any time he thought of her, he acted like a sulking child. He caught his grandfather watching them and leaned away from her to continue eating, aware how this may look. Aware that his grandfather had already scolded him for not being more gracious to the woman who was now part of his family. Yuji cleared his throat and focused on his food, moving away to show he was putting distance between them, and she should stop talking. Tangshi lowered her chin and put all her effort on getting through the 2 bowls in front of her, zoning out so she didn't taste them as much and hoping she would be excused as soon as she was done. It had been an exhausting day again, with all the plans and appointments thrust on her. After yesterday's shopping trip, and tomorrow she had a full half day at a beauty salon to change her hair and take some makeup lessons. She felt this frivolous waste of her time was beyond boring and would rather be painting alone in her suite. Auntie had been persistent that she wasn't to be seen outside these walls anywhere near Yuji until she was considered presentable by Aunt's standards, which meant magazine-worthy given her position in the fashion industry, which explained her anal attitude towards it. And unluckily for Tangshi, today had been minus the protective and somewhat calming presence of Ria. "You are looking very well today, Tangshi." Grandfather startled her by suddenly addressing her directly, and she almost choked on her mouthful of unsalted broth, glancing his way and covering her mouth with a napkin to save herself from spitting up everywhere. Swallowing hard to clear her mouth, she nodded and lowered her head towards the old man and gave him a soft smile. Her heart racing because, much like his grandson, he had pretended she didn't exist for the last couple of days. "Thank you. Under Auntie's great direction and care, I spent the day taking note of my skin health and my fitness. I aim to be better," Tangshi replied in the way she knew was expected of her, secretly hating the fact she had underwent hours of waxing, preening, and being smothered in various clays and creams and having her body rolled in massage until she was black and blue. Some called it a pamper day, but to Tangshi it was sheer torture with a high price tag. Even her nails were currently manicured and adorned with tiny encrusted diamonds that made her hands look nothing like that of an artist who worked with paint and charcoal. Good. This family expects it." He gave her a curt answer with a nod, but he didn't seem as annoyed with her as when she first sat down to eat, and she wondered if this was his way of finally saying he forgave her for being late for breakfast yesterday. Tangshi smiled at him as genuinely as she could, satisfied he wanted no more conversation beyond his little acknowledgement of her, and turned back to her food, catching Yuji glaring at her from the corner of her eye. She could feel his icy coldness waving her way from his stiff posture, and she could tell that it annoyed him that the old man had mellowed already. He seemed to want the old man to dislike her as much as he did, and now he would have to do something else to mischievously cause another misunderstanding. She was aware of it this time, and wouldn't be trapped like that again. This man was so immature. Yuji picked up his glass and drank some of his water, unsure why grandfather's 2-second conversation with this girl would irritate him so much, but it did. In life he had more control over his moods, but the second he met this woman, something inside of him just picked up a red flag and stuck it in his face. "If you are done eating, go to bed," You have to take care of your body for my child's sake, and sleep is of great importance. You are dismissed," he commanded her loudly, drawing the attention to the eating diners who were not all that interested in her, making it clear he wanted her to leave already. Aunt seemed to smirk while the younger woman next to her, who looked a lot like Yuji, glanced at Tangshi, and yet seemed to frown a little. "I am done. I'll do as you say. Thank you for the meal." Tangshi appeared to be obedient to her new husband, but the truth was she had been looking for any excuse to escape since they came in here. She hadn't eaten much, but it seemed Yuji was more focused on making her go away than to care anymore. Tangshi was relieved and exhaled, with a soft sigh. Xiaosu caught her eye from the edge of the room, where she had been patiently awaiting her miss, and Tangshi nodded for her to exit and lead her out. Her path to freedom, and on the way Xiaosu could bypass the kitchen and grab her some fruit or whatever was to hand. "Wait!" A new voice that had never addressed her before called out to her, and Tangshi turned quickly to not appear rude. Aware that despite introductions earlier, no one had made it clear what their standing in this family was, and this sounded young, so could be either of the two young misses present. "Yes," she replied, unsure which woman this came from, and gave a sweeping glance around and then to the youngest lady who had focused on her a moment ago, the one who held a strong resemblance to her annoying husband, and she hoped they didn't share a personality too. "I feel so rude to have not done this before we started eating, but I won't be here in the morning. I am Jun, your sister-in-law. My brother should have introduced us when we sat, but I am afraid he has all the manners of a spoiled brat. So welcome, Tangshi. I hope we can become close sisters in time." Jun smiled as she said the words, making it clear it was with affection, and not a real insult, and no one at the table blinked an eye at her teasing of her brother. For a moment, it softened Tangshi's tight nerves, and she relaxed with a genuine smile in response. Tangshi bowed lightly towards the girl, aware of all the eyes of the half-dozen diners now filtering her way as she was suddenly on show with standing here. The last few days had been a strained existence, but she was determined not to make things worse while under this roof. If she had to submit, smile her days away, and be as timid as she could, then so be it. She wanted a peaceful life. Yuji sighed, gave his sister a frown, and carried on eating as if this was somehow nothing to do with him. Obviously annoyed, she intervened on his chasing away his new bride. Jun was not as clueless as she made out, and she had a keen eye for details and small interactions. This girl Tangshi interested her because of the way her brother seemed to revert to being a prickly teen in her presence. She hadn't seen anything but cold and disinterested from him for a number of years. Ria was the only one which pulled any kind of thawing, but even then, he was so proper and prim even around her, it was like he was a feeling-less corpse. "It is nice to meet you, Jun." "Thank you. I hope we will have a great relationship in time." Tangshi sounded polite and robotic as she churned out another expected response, then grimaced when she realized how forced it sounded. She was normally better at social interaction, but she was dead on her feet and needing to slide away to peace and quiet. Her body ached, her head was weary, and she wanted to go. 3 days of non-stop doing was not how she normally lived her life, and the constant tension of living under a strained atmosphere was wearing her down. "I will be back in a week. I come every Tuesday. Maybe I can come earlier in the day, and we could sit out in the garden and get to know one another. I am at college and live in dorms, so I am not often around." Jun was persistent, but Tangshi softened a little. For like Ria, this girl gave her no hints of ill intention, and she relaxed a little, hoping her gut instincts on judging people were not letting her down, and she accepted gratefully. Any kind of warmth from these people was to be jumped on and treasured, for she was sure she wouldn't get a lot of it in the next 2 years. Already, she could tell among most of them her position was not important, or even noticed. "I would like that." "Thank you, sister-in-law Jun." Tangshi made one final bow, and with a gracious goodbye she turned and followed Xiaosu into the hallway, and they made their escape with a heave of relief and hurried steps. June narrowed her eyes at her brother, and he caught her smiling his way, looking like a Cheshire cat. "What is it, brat?" He frowned at her, pushed some braised beef into his mouth, and ignored her continued fixation on his face. "Nothing, just curious why my ice-cold brother suddenly acts like a moody boy and treats his wife like an unruly, unwanted employee, when it more your style to glare and ignore." "Don't you have more grace? You barely looked her way at all, unless it was to tell her off, and seemed you can't stop yourself from doing it. Do you dislike her so much, or is it that you are so intrigued that you are worried you might like her too much?" Jun had always been bold and to the point, something that Yuji both adored at times and sometimes, like right now, abhorred. "Shut up, you have no idea what you are talking about." Yuji glared her way, instantly angered by her foolishness, and denied it completely, shaking his head and throwing his focus back on his food. Sometimes he was sure his sister had been dropped on her head as a baby. "You doth detest too much." Jun grinned, amused by his instant snap, thinking she had found something to toy with, but her brother then reverted to the person she had been surprised not to see since she got here. He instantly closed up, his face returned to a mask of indifference, and he shrugged nonchalantly. The armor in place, and he exuded an immediate improvement in maturity as he sighed at his sister as though she were a mere annoying fly, all too good at putting himself back in place, and being who he usually was. When that damned woman wasn't riling him, "You young people think you know everything and yet have a lot to learn. Eat your food or go home. Either way, get on with it. Brat." Yuji smirked at her and winked, taking some of the harshness out of his words, but his fiery little sister only shook her head. She was completely unfazed as the family ignored their bickering and continued with eating and small talk. They were used to the siblings being this way with one another, and it was nothing interesting to listen to. Even grandfather ignored their squabbles with an affectionate smile. June tucked her chin down to eat, but a small ember of something grew in her brain, and she glanced her brother's way and then at the empty doorframe where that girl had gone. She was going to get to know Tangxi and figure out what it was about her that made her brother so blatantly unkind and impatient with her. He had always been a distant kind of person with most people, and it had only worsened in the last few years. But this girl struck something in him, and she was intrigued to see where it would go. Fanning his temper was better than the iceberg he had been for years. She pushed his patience, for which he was famed. She brought out a side of him that was missing for a long time since he came home from the military, even if it wasn't his best side, and she wasn't so sure her brother's dislike was that at all. She had seen him with people he truly hated, and yet he was good at playing cool and undisturbed, and the lack of reaction and emotion always made him less human. It was how he handled all conflict, and never let his enemies ruffle his feathers or get under his skin, no matter what they did. Why was this girl so different? She hadn't done anything near as bad as people he truly disliked over the years. John couldn't help but feel hopeful that with even an ounce of her brother's mask being moved, that maybe this girl would help revive other parts of her brother that she missed so much too. He may be mean, but any kind of reaction was better than the lack of any. 8 years of nothing, and John was excited to see a ripple.